on the fence on what it can be doing. So I'm anxious to see how our discussions go. So Kyle, the stage is yours.
Sorry about that. Pleasure to be here. Thank you again for having me. As I'll talk about here, I think blockchain technologies are really dependent on raising awareness in the community. You know, it's a different setup than some other tech that you can kind of do on your own. This very much requires and enables collaboration. And so getting other people to think about it and think about other use cases and think about how we can collaborate together, I think is really, really important. So I'm going to talk about the Synaptic Health Alliance as an example, so that we kind of can talk about something that's working, that's in production and being used. So I think that's helpful when we talk about the technology. But I'm going to start off with some of kind of like the why blockchain, and then I'll also kind of jump into a demo as well. And so my intent is to kind of cover this material in the first half of the meeting. If you want to put some notes in the comments, we can kind of refer back to that for questions. If you really want to jump in here and interrupt, that's fine by me. But my intent really is to kind of just spend the first half going through these things. Then we can revisit slides and talk about certain things as well. And so again, pleasure to be here. I am the Director of Emerging Technology at Humana and one of the co-founders of the Synaptic Health Alliance. I've been leaning into the blockchain space since the 2015, 2016 timeframe. And so the first two slides here, the first is talking about why blockchain. So I'll spend a little time on that and then talk about some of the things that we hear that are negative about blockchain, and then kind of jump into what we're doing with Synaptic, and then jump into that demo. So again, if you're not familiar, and I'm not going to get crazy technically deep on these things, but the big difference, you know, for blockchain compared to things that we're more familiar with is that you're not just sharing the data, which we can do today, and we have many ways in which to share data, but you're also able to share logic. And I think that's a kind of a different thing. So today, everybody may be familiar with APIs, and you throw data in an API, and it does some logic, and it comes back with a response. But that logic's normally on the other side of that endpoint that maybe you don't know what's really happening, and that's more of a black box. And so by decentralizing that logic and now pushing that out, making that accessible, now you can see both the data and the logic. And so that's really what the difference is when they talk about, hey, that we have these nodes. And so that means that if we all on this meeting have, you know, these blockchain nodes running, then we all have access to that same data and that same logic. Now, there's different caveats to that, but that's really, I think, the premise there. And that's different than us integrating and interacting, you know, with an endpoint that is centralized and owned and more of a black box. The other thing that we see that's different is it's community owned. And so when we look at Synaptic, you know, Synaptic's not a company. It's an alliance of a number of companies that are working together on a common problem. And then that community owns that code set, and we own the direction of that product, and we own the pricing, right, of what we're going to charge so that that is sustainable and equitable for the group. And so that is different than working with a vendor, even if it's a nonprofit vendor, and trying to determine what is the pricing for that and how is that going to work. There's just a different mechanism in how we approach that and how we govern that. The other piece is that normally you have open source code within this. And so that allows others to contribute. That allows other people to potentially create something separate and different that goes in a different direction, has different features. And so that openness creates a lot of competition, which I think can be concerning for some if you're trying to create proprietary things. However, there is this level of visibility that allows us to know more and trust more in what's going on, not because, you know, because it's simply in blockchain makes it more trusted, just because you can see it and because you can test it and work with it, you know what's happening versus that being behind some wall that you really don't understand or don't have access to. And then the other piece that I mentioned a little bit is that transparent and accessible transactions. So now if that data is being stored, you know, as a result of these transactions, when you have this big audit trail, that allows you to understand what's going on. That allows you to understand, has this account done these type of activities before? Is it something that's worked with these different things before? It kind of can give you a little more context and history of what's happened in this space with these different accounts, than you may have in another scenario where you don't have that access. And then the last two, again, are also not technology things. When you think about the decentralized governance, what we see in these models is you have this very decentralized governance model where everybody's contributing to where the directions of the product should go, proposals for new features, how money should be spent, and different things like that. So it's really interesting when we look at how that compares with other things that we're familiar with and how they're governed, that they're trying to govern these newer decentralized communities in a very transparent way, and they're building tools to enable that. And so I think as these tools continue to grow and continue to get more mature, we're going to see people start borrowing and using those in other community groups where there's a need for governance and transparent interaction from decision-making processes. And then the last piece is these incentive models, and looking at new ways in which to incentivize the right activity for the community. And so when we look at Synaptic, and we can talk through that example, we're looking to encourage people to share data that's valuable to the community. And if you just want to consume data, then you're going to pay to consume the data. But the intent of the group isn't to have this big revenue stream that's coming from these interactions. The intent is really that's just sustainable and equitable for the group, and really functioning more as a utility, which I think is really neat when we look at healthcare. We have some systemic problems that are bigger than one organization is going to be able to fix on their own. And so I think there are some real opportunities here where we're talking about this is a way to potentially bring people together and say, hey, we're going to own it as a group, right? It's not going to be owned by this entity that's going to charge us rent later, or these couple incumbents, that are competitors of ours. But we as a community are going to own this, and we're going to build it as a utility, and we're going to set the pricing for it. And we're going to set that pricing so that it has the features that it needs and it meets our needs. However, the intent with that isn't, focused on growth, right, and returns. It's really just trying to meet a common need. So that's really the high level. There are other things and other aspects, but when I start thinking about how to communicate why blockchain to a group, and I think it'll make a little more sense when we talk about it, not abstractly, but with the example of Synaptic, these are the things that jump out to me. Before we jump into the example, I do think it's worth talking about, some of the things that are concerns. We hear a lot about energy consumption, and I think that that's a true concern for some of the public blockchains, just because of the way they're configured. And again, I'm not going to dig into the depth of this, but there are ways in which to configure these, especially like Synaptic, where it's more of a trusted group that's working together, where we don't need that same level of energy consumption. It's very similar to other types of software implementations. That energy consumption in these public setups are really a cost to participate. They are making you burn energy so that you can't participate for free. And that's how they can counteract some of the bad or malicious behavior and make it to where the community's working together, and they're using energy within some of these decisions to help with that. There are with blockchain a ton of negative press, and people that have done things that were nefarious and had different Ponzi schemes, or a lot of charlatans in the space that were able to sell people into believing blockchain was going to solve all the problems, and then they ran away with money. So those things did happen, because I think it's complex and people didn't really understand what was being sold and how to use it. And so I think there are some negative things that have occurred out there. However, I don't believe that we should let that inform how we're going to interact or what we see as the longer term opportunity, because there are some efficiencies when we look at the architecture, when we look at some of the other things that I talked about on the first slide that I think are really valuable for us long term. But we do need to be critical of what really is the value here. How is this different than what we have today? and not kind of get sold on the next shiny thing that people are offering, within blockchain. Security concerns. I think you can't go a week without hearing about something in some cryptocurrency that someone get hacked. A lot of these are phishing scams, similar to what we see, with email and with other things. Some of these have been to where, they found a vulnerability in that code that's shared. That is, I think, one of the, good things about things being open source is that people get to see it, and it should get, hardened over time. So what we see is a lot of these are newer things or things that haven't went through the appropriate level of scrutiny and audit that then are getting, hacked because, people see a vulnerability. But over time, these things are getting more and more secure, but there still need to be processes in place that check that code and ensure that security as changes occur. The cost and resources to run, the energy consumption is an aspect, but I would say, what we've seen with Synaptic, what we see now is that it really feels like a SaaS solution. There are things you don't have to run, an entity can run that for you if you want to. If you don't want to own, the complexity, there are some newer technologies like Kubernetes that are normal in this space, and so people, sometimes choose to let a vendor host that and run that for them. So they just interact, and from their perspective, it's really just a SaaS type interaction. Scalability and performance is another thing. As with any technology, there are considerations that need to be taken as you're looking at the trade-offs between different design choices and how you architect things. But we have been able to see that we can get scalability and performance in these solutions, especially when we look at if we control the variables. With a permission solution like Synaptic, it's a very different setup than some of the public solutions. But the public solutions now, especially Ethereum, some of the more prominent ones are finding ways to get to very high throughput and roadmaps that'll get them to kind of like a Visa network type throughput there. So again, just wanted to touch on these. Happy again to touch on these during the questions part, the back half of this meeting. But wanted to touch on those two things before we get started with Synaptic. And so kind of jumping into the real world example and kind of the value that it's creating, we're looking at the use case of provider directory. And so when Synaptic was formed in 2018, it was really coming with the intent to say these technologies we believe allow us to collaborate and allow us to create value. They give us a lot more value if there's external companies that are working together, and less value if blockchain's internal to a company. There are better things to do if you trust the entities or if you own the entities that are communicating. And so when we look at blockchain and we look at those opportunities, we said, hey, we need a starting point that is less risky. And so provider directory, with that being public, Dr. Smith on Market Street at this phone number accepting new patients, that's a big problem in the industry. It has very low quality data. I have the CMS results here on the screen. That basically half the records have something wrong just in those elements that are in the right hand corner, those 5 elements there. And we spend a lot of money as an industry, over $2 billion, trying to maintain it. And that duplicative activity as well. So Humana and Aetna and United and others are all managing this record separately. We're all making phone calls to that doctor separately. I imagine the people on this call have some experience with this type of use case. And so the intent here was really, let's start with that, because that's a problem for us, and figure out what are the things that we can do to crowdsource, and how do we learn about governance, how do we learn to work together, and what are some of the other things that will be useful, not just to this use case, but to other use cases in the future. And so we went through this process, and adding blockchain to anything doesn't just fix it, right? It took us some time to figure out, what are the ways that we can work together, what are the processes that we need. And so when we started to work together, we started to look at what are people's operational processes to go and collect that data, what metadata needs to be shared so that we can make a decision on the quality of the data that's being shared. And it took us some time to really get to how do we, have the right processes as well as the right technical infrastructure to be able to share that data to make it valuable. Also, because of the new technology, there were a lot of things that were changing with it. And so it took us some time to kind of get to where we are now, or we actually have a product that is connected to our operational systems and is creating value, and then we're scaling out to other states. And so we found that, our problem isn't that we don't have enough data. The problem is really separating the signal from the noise. And so really being able to get a strong signal from the other organizations to say, hey, this data is correct, or Dr. Smith's data has been updated and you need to go apply this update, and making sure that those are high quality information that are coming in was something that we worked together and have really made a lot of progress on, kind of getting into that 90% threshold to where we can really trust the data that we're receiving from these other organizations. So I'll talk about this a little more when I look at the screen and kind of go into the demo quickly. But there are different activities, getting back to the incentive model. We said, hey, we don't believe that if we altruistically say, let's just share data, that'll play out long term. People may start off with that intent, but over time, people are going to say, well, why am I adding this data and this other person's just consuming? They never add it, or I'm a lot bigger, as a company and this other company, and so I don't understand, how this is working. So we really wanted to have an incentive model that rewarded companies for adding value, and that reward came from the companies that were consuming that value. And so there is a cost to subscribe to a record. That's done at the NPI level. So Dr. Smith and Dr. Smith's records, and that would be records across the different participants. And then with that, you have validations and challenges and the opportunity to flag. And so with that, let me go to the website because it's easier, I think, to just show it here. So this is, again, the decentralized application. So what we're seeing here is this is Humana's view on the data. So this includes the public data from Synaptic that's been shared, as well as Humana's data, because I'm logged in as Humana. And that's what's stored on the Humana-owned infrastructure. United would have the public data and United's data, right? And everybody's going to have a little different data based on what they purchased, as well as what they're sharing. But then everybody's going to have the public data elements of the information that's been shared. And so we have, the records here, and these records are at the address phone number level. So Dr. Smith may have, 10 records at these different locations. And then the different activities here on the right of the different subscriptions, challenging as you saying that something is wrong with an incentive in place. And so if you are actually challenging someone and you're wrong, there's a penalty there, but then there's also a reward if you're correct. We needed that because we have a lot of people who have strong, opinions about their data, and we didn't want everybody to show up and say, hey, everybody else's data is wrong, my data is right, and then we're left kind of holding the bag to try to sort that out. And then the flag is the same as the challenge, but it doesn't have any incentive model behind it. And so you're saying, hey, I think it's wrong, but don't hold me to it type of deal. And then if you look at these other columns, they're items that have been attested to, I believe, in the past 90 days of recent, and then current records differs because these are things that we're actually publishing in our directory. So we're not just sharing the active records, we're also sharing kind of things that have been removed. And so that's kind of the difference between this first column and then the current. When I go, I think there's one other thing I'd like to show, that there's this capability that we call impact. We were looking at impact. Again, I'm logged in as Humana. This is showing that we have a Humana record and other participants have more recent data than we do. And so for this second record, we're showing that, hey, we haven't touched this record since 10/26/2020, and United has something from July. And so if we go in and we dig into that record, now we can start seeing the overlap between things that were shared a long time ago from United and then what Humana has. And then if we expand that out, you can see the actual properties. And so we found that this interface is really what's needed for the operators. Again, the persona that's using this is one of those operators that is managing the data. They're looking to use this to avoid a phone call and say, oh, United has better data, or I need to go check on this, or use it as a signal to say someone else said our data was wrong. We're going to trust that and use that to, again, clean up our data. And a lot of the time, this website's really not used because these folks have other workflow systems. And so there's an API that's really behind all this that they're integrating into their workflow system. So the folks that are managing this data and managing the different operational processes that are needed are able to take advantage of this data. So I'm about 24 minutes in or so. I can go through other parts of the website. I haven't taken a look at the comments, but I see that there's a few. I'm going to stop sharing and pause and see if we have any questions, and then go back to share a little bit more depending on where the questions are.
Yeah, we do have one question. Let's see here. I think it was from Robin. When you talk about energy consumption, are you referring to electricity consumption or the spending of one's personal effort?
It's a good question. It's the actual electricity consumption. And so in certain solutions, what it's doing is it's requiring a lot of processing time to participate. So your participation cost requires your computer to do a lot of work, which then translates to a lot of electricity.
Okay. Thanks, Cap. I think that's the only question we have. What we'll do is we'll open up for discussions and have people raise their hands as we go forward. I'm queuing up a bunch of questions here too, so I'll keep you going if others don't have it.
Okay, and I know that was really fast too, so apologies. I get pretty fast talking. If you have a question when we go through something again, happy to do that as well.
Okay, go for it, Cal.
Okay, and so I can reshare my screen and go more into some of the other aspects of the system, but didn't know if, Ed, if you wanted to raise some of your questions and go to there, but happy to go either way.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So just a question, just on the actual project itself. What were some of your challenges getting it going? And then talk about how you've come so far and the rewards that you've experienced putting this all together.
Sure. And so from a challenges perspective, as you would imagine, working with, and I'll go back to, who some of these other organizations are, like working with large organizations and getting everybody to agree on things takes time. That's very different than having the autonomy to make that decision yourself. And so it's good because we got a lot of different perspectives and we learned a lot, but it's slower than you would be on your own. The other piece is contracting. So this isn't a company. We have a treasurer, but going to your procurement organization and saying, hey, we're in a contract with this vendor and some other company is going to pay for that, but we're going to backstop it because we have the agreement. Like, it's just a weird kind of setup. It's abnormal. And so some of the legal type things that you need to do were different. Everybody was very accommodating. We had really good people. It just takes a while to get some of that understood, as well as talking through, what is that definitive agreement? And so when we looked at, we need as a group to have a definitive agreement, how do we handle IP? How do we handle data? Like all those things, and getting, a large number of companies to agree on those terms did take a while. And so I think those were probably, some of the bigger challenges. There's also kind of this onboarding new people from different areas. And so as with any company, you have some turnover, you have people that get promoted or moved to different roles. And so within that, you're onboarding people to, this is what we're doing, this is how this works, and those same types of things that you experience with any product in a single company. But now you have these different companies. And then also you don't have a hierarchical org chart, right? And so you can't say, this is the one decision maker, we're going to roll it up to this one person and they're going to make that decision. It is kind of more of a group, that you're influencing and bringing opinion on. I will say that the really neat thing is we do have a good group of people that work very well together. We didn't have these big contentious decisions. Like, for the most part, when someone had a concern, they were able to explain their concern. We were able to talk through it, but it never really became one of these heated things where people hung up, walked away, or anything like that. Like, we know that there are opportunities for us to work together. And so I think everybody was very excited about the opportunity to work together and wanting to find, a way in which to do it.
You talked about electricity. So talk about what kind of volumes are hitting this application and How have you tuned it from a performance perspective?
Yeah, and so that was definitely a learning thing as well. Like when you're talking about the amount of data, Humana and some of these other organizations have the ability to touch thousands of records per day, right? Or definitely per week. And so that's a lot of volume when you're looking at the different updates. If you're updating the attestation date to say, hey, y'all still good, maybe it's wrong, and sharing that out. And so how we share that data in an efficient way, and then also kind of learning through removing data. So when you say, hey, this is wrong, or we have a contract termination, so Dr. Smith may still be at Market Street, but we're not working with them anymore. How do you represent that?
Right.
Those were things that we learned what we were going to do, but we didn't know exactly what the scale was across the group. And so there were a couple of things there when we got actually connected to our operational systems and started asking questions and learning through that we had different scales than we did at the beginning of our requirements phase. And so we had to kind of go back and revisit some of those things. And then also making sure that we're focused on value. I think, when I'm talking about, hey, we can challenge records and we can arbitrate, we can do all this stuff. Really, there's a ton of value in us just learning, did someone validate it or did someone remove it? Like these other processes are great, and I think we'll get there, but there's really just a lot of value in us not making duplicative calls and being able to collectively take advantage of the activity that's going on.
Okay, and one quick follow-up, and then we have someone in the chat. So I'm trying to inspire conversation, and we've got 2 in there. So one more, just real quick. So how many records are in that database? So how many providers are represented?
I don't know at an NPL level, there may be a way, but I think this is showing we have a little over 2 million total records. So again, that's at the doctor phone number address. So everything we're managing context wise is really at that level.
All right, respect. I'm going to order this a little bit differently because we have 2 questions about smart contracts. I'll start with Rachel, and then we'll follow up with the more detailed question on smart contracts. So Rachel would like for you to explain, what do you mean by smart contract?
Sure. And so think about like that is the logic that we as a group are using for some of those incentive model transactions. So when Humana says we have an update and we share that update, what does that mean? And really what that means is we're persisting some data, and we're going to get rewarded if somebody else subscribes to our data. And so, and if we were first to say this information, we get a different reward than if somebody who's second. Now there's a timetable on it. We don't hold that forever because there's a recency. We're trying to get people to update things, monthly or quarterly or whatever, right? We're trying to get that update. But the logic is really in that smart contract. It's similar to if you've heard of like a stored procedure within the database. It's similar to when people put logic in there. It's a little different because we all get it, but it's really close to writing the data and then making sure that we're in agreement to what are the terms and conditions. Certainly when we're talking about financial transactions, the terms and conditions to that agreement.
Yeah, Kyle, I kind of liken it to calling in the old mainframe days, we call it calling an exit, or in fire, calling a hook, or calling an API, right? You're calling logic, right? To perform that function. Okay, and I see Brian B has put in some descriptions and even a link for you, Rachel, for you to really get into it. Okay, now Brian B, you actually asked the question: Are smart contracts used in the SHA blockchain ecosystem? Would you kind of cover there, but maybe give it a little more detail there, Kyle?
Yeah, and so for those incentive model transactions, and I'm sharing my screen again, all of those are associated to smart contracts on the back end. So, from our perspective, we're just clicking a button, but what's really happening is that's interacting with our node and then interacting with that smart contract on that node, which then is getting consensus from the group on the output. So that's another piece. The smart contract, when it says, okay, I'm going to have this logic execute, all the nodes, or majority of the nodes, have to agree on what that's going to be. So there's like an algorithm to how we agree on the result. So if there is a difference in result, that there's a mechanism in which, because now it's decentralized, right, we can have different results potentially on these different nodes. But yes, all of like to be able to challenge, to be able to add new records, to be able to subscribe to records, those are all run in smart contracts.
Yeah, Kyle, it's funny when we were talking one-on-one. Yeah, I was a little bit of a skeptic towards something I heard on a previous Weedy education session where they say you can use blockchain to do real-time adjudication. I was just kind of like, come on, man. That's, I think of logging in blockchain, right? Irrefutable logging in blockchain. But then you brought up the term smart contracts, where as the data is coming through, you can kick off different, logic areas to be able to take you through the different steps it would take to adjudicate a claim, which would be a lot of code, right? So I kind of push back to you, just kind of defending to the audience your thoughts of how you could do it with performance in mind.
Sure. So my entry, I guess just to set context, my entry into blockchain was writing a white paper about how claims could and should be decentralized.
Yeah.
But the technology at that point, like 2016 timeframe, wasn't where it is today. But when you think about it, you have two agreements. You have an agreement, let's use Humana, between Humana and this doctor, this provider that says, this is our contract, these are our rates, right? And how we're going to handle those. You have another agreement between Kyle and Humana. So as a member, right, here are your accumulators, here's what you're going to pay, and here's how this is going to work. So we basically have these two sets of logic that can be represented, right, in smart contracts. Because today they're represented, right, in logic within our data center. And when we know that 90%-ish of claims are adjudicated automatically, right, like we could move that code from where it is today and now make it accessible. Another difference in 2016, there wasn't price transparency rules, right? So there was like, hey, I'm not putting all my logic out there, right? Yeah. But today, like that's a little different, right? So that those rates and things like that are now starting to be more and more shared, right? So that confidentiality is a little different. And so I think that would change a lot. And we talk about performance, just because, it may take a little bit and it may not be as, as fast potentially as what it is, but we're looking at claims that are taking a long time between that 837 and when you get that 835 back, right? And so if you're saying you could make that to more of a near real time, or you could do pre-adjudication, or you could do a good faith estimate, all those things will be very dependent on that logic. And now we have an audit trail. So the other really neat part, I think, is when you look at if that logic now becomes accessible, you can code against it. It's not kind of this guess and check, like this is what it is. And so denials are a different thing because, you're actually going and executing that code. So if it should fail or if it needs a document or whatever that might be, that can be checked way farther up in the stream than it is today.
Yeah, I'm thinking of Humana. You have tons of claims coming in daily. The performance requirements for that would be pretty strong. I would imagine blockchain adds a level of overhead towards the actual, running the code purely as, within separate processes. So just a thought there regarding overhead.
Well, but think about it being decentralized. So let's say we work with 1,000 providers. Now we have 1,000 different nodes that are running that, right? So it is a little different, and they're doing kind of that lookup to pull in whatever reference information they need. I believe all this stuff, needs to be demonstrated, right? Everybody's like, hey, you can tell me it's going to work, but I've done claims before, right? Like you need to show me, and I believe that that's completely fair. But I do think what we see where things are going, I don't think we're going to have a concern with the performance or the ways in which to get past that. You can even have direct interaction. So kind of like have a side chain where it's like us and a large provider where we have a lot of claims. And then maybe for small providers, they work over here and then they all anchor to kind of something that's more of a layer one. And so when we see across technology, there's always been these conversations around, the internet's not going to be able to handle videos, right? And all these things that over time, we figure out a way to do it, even if it is a barrier today.
Yeah, interesting. So a lot of asynchronous type communications, right? Each contract represents a separate thread, if you will, right?
Well, and peer-to-peer. So I think that's the other piece. So instead of you pushing data through all these pipes, right, between, the systems. Like today, you really are notifying, who you're going to interact with, right? So the provider would say, hey, I have a claim for you. And then the conversation becomes very direct. And there's a protocol underneath of it versus today where it's more of a pipe, right? Like an email where you send it and then it gets sent somewhere else, then it gets delivered, and then it kind of comes back through that chain with those EDI messages.
Okay. Well, thanks, Cal. By the way, to everyone in the audience, please feel free to raise your hand or put in the chat. I'm just asking lots of questions to inspire you, and hopefully I'm not being boring. Well, Cal, you're not. I might be. No Surprises Act, right? I mean, you have a provision for provider directory. And this is a little off of the blockchain topic, right? But how do you all feel you're adhering to the spirit of, I don't think there's going to be actually a rule that will be coming out with no surprise. I think they actually announced that provider directories, you just have to adhere to it, right? How is that meeting that particular spirit?
Right. And so I think, if I understand your question right, we're talking about that the provider directories have to be public, right? Now that you have to make those public and make those accessible, right, via APIs. Is that what you're talking about?
And accurate. Yeah.
Right.
Right.
Well, I mean, inaccuracy was always something that was regulated where they would come in and audit. I think where Synaptic plays is there's this capability now to crowdsource. So there's other metadata there. Like, did you get that on a phone call? Did they put that in your portal? Did you get a fax? Like all that metadata, and when did you attest to that information? And so I think that metadata is really what's been valuable for us to really inform, what's the quality of that information, and then being able to divide and conquer and say, hey, I'm going to call these. Who are you going to call? Like that capability is now there to be able to share that information, which is much different than, today where everybody's kind of duplicating a lot of that effort or buying from a vendor.
Okay, and to everyone in the audience, Kyle has no idea what I'm going to ask him, so you're doing an awesome job. Something we did mention before, and I'd like for you to kind of respond to it or consider it. You're getting different entries on the same provider, and there's got to be different levels of trust and scoring on who's correct. And it looks like you're putting up a list of the logging activity, what everybody, I've noticed this person lives at this address, or this person changed this, or maybe have a different office or whatever. Is there any sorts of scoring based on trusted sources, or this one's more real, this entry is more reliable than the other? Well, I'm just curious.
Yeah, that's a great question. So when we started this, right, we weren't starting from scratch. All these organizations had, different analytics to say what's the quality. And they use claims information, they use other information that they have to help them understand, is this data accurate or not? And so this ended up being another set of information coming in that they would add to and increase the quality of the information. And so we intentionally made the choice not to say that Synaptic has this golden record, right? That we believe this is true. What we're really trying to do is let people understand what other people have, and then start learning to what the quality is when we audit it. And so then we audit it and say, hey, 90% of the time I agree with this other organization. So now that's equal to a phone call for me, which I also value at 90%. And so those were the decisions that each organization was making, with the intent that we would learn to how to incorporate that and make that more of an alliance decision. However, you do have different thresholds. Some people are saying, hey, give me everything. I'll take it. It's better than what I got. And then other people are saying, okay, well, I have better information than this. I'm not going to take everything. I'm going to be very strategic with what I take.
Right. So I'll circle back. So Price Transparency and No Surprises Act. Which record should I use? You have like 10 records. So is there a way that, the organization, I guess, would have to keep their own copy and not use your source, right? It would be more of this is the reconciliation place, and they'd have their own databases, correct?
Right. So what we are printing, what Humana is putting out there via that API is the truth, right? This is that record. The Alliance is allowing us to share that as well, right? So it's over that channel. Here's what's public. Here's what we're sharing. But we also have kind of that we removed this record, right? like we're no longer printing this. So there's some different data points that are available that are really valuable to the group. They're different, and then also some metadata things that we've determined, over the years that are valuable too, that are collected and shared there.
Okay. Is there any kind of API interface to this so that you can query it from your apps?
Yes, and I can share that too. Yeah, and so this is kind of the API. And so that's what people are doing. They're connecting this to their workflow. And they're saying, okay, the X number of people I have that manage this data, let's connect it to the system that they use so that they can do search, integrate it. So it's hey, here's what we have, here's what Synaptic has, or build a feed in to where you're collecting those hooks, as you mentioned, and now you're getting updates for the information and saying, oh, okay, that data is now changed. I should go subscribe to that, or I've already subscribed to it. I should just go and apply that.
So you're pushing information out by subscribing. Is that correct?
Yes, and so if I subscribe, to Dr. Smith's information, now I'm getting those events and updates about Dr. Smith. I'm also getting all the public events, and so the public events tells you something changed, but it doesn't tell you if it validated it or deleted it or right. So it's just not giving you context, but saying, hey, something changed. And then when you purchase, when you do subscribe, that's when you get the full context around that record. You get it for, I believe, a duration of 90 days.
Right. You said something in your slides that I thought was really fun. You called people charlatans. So of those nefarious charlatans, what technology are you using from an authentication perspective?
So we have a definitive agreement with other organizations, right? And so we have a very different risk profile, in the fact that we're working with these organizations to share public data. If they do, nefarious things, we have different levers and things we can do. If you're in the public sector and now you have anybody that can go and do work out there, it's a very different risk profile. I think they're still learning, what some of those things are. You have a lot of people, like solutions that, people are representing others and say, hey, there's 1,000 people, but really it's just one person pretending to be 1,000 people, right? And so there's a lot of activity like that people are doing to say they have adoption or that this is being used in this way. And I think people are learning, about these things and getting smarter every day, but there's still somebody, some people out there that are trying to take advantage of the system.
Okay, thanks, Kyle. I'll slow down. Let's ask the audience, and don't be shy. This is a very safe environment. We can make fun of Kyle as much as we want. I promised that we would do that. So please ask any question if you like, and I'll take pause. I think I've just went through most of my questions.
So there's a question here about resources, in a book on blockchain. I would say there are a couple books and they're okay, but the space is changing pretty quickly. The venture capitalists who play in this space tend to have pretty decent resources. Now, granted, they're trying to sell this because they've invested in it. So some of this stuff, I would say take a grain of salt, but like the Andreessen Horowitz, so A16Z, and others have some pretty good resources out there on like what is blockchain, what is Web3, what's the ownership economy. Like some of these terms you hear, they do a good job of painting a picture around why that's important and why that's different. And that's all public information, that they have out there on their websites.
Okay, it looks like Bill has a futuristic question. Fast forward 5 years, what does the ideal participant list look like for the Alliance? Do you want more payers, providers, vendors, etc.?
So I would say more providers. So we're pretty payer heavy now, just because I think provider directory at that point in time in 2018, and for like the payers were feeling the pain of maintaining provider directory more. However, the intent would be to grow with more providers and then do other use cases. And so really looking at how we can have, kind of a larger impact, whether that be on administrative transactions or clinical interactions, or wherever this may go. There's a lot of talk about credentialing and saving with that. One of our members, ProCredX, that just joined, is looking at the credentialing space so that can be reused and be more efficient. So I think when we start looking across healthcare and saying there's $1 trillion of waste out here, how do we make this more efficient and really get after that? I do think we need to be more complete on the provider side.
Okay, cool, Kyle. Thanks. Since Bill brought up the future, any cool, I know this may not be something you may want to share, but I'll have to ask the question. Any cool extensions are you looking towards on this project or others related to blockchain?
So I think zero knowledge proofs is something that you may have heard about. Like there's a lot of research in the cryptography space, because again, we're taking part in some public interactions, and they're saying, how do we maintain privacy in this public world, right? If I send Ed $10 and then people are like, hey, Kyle just did this presentation and then he sent Ed $10, what's going on, right? Like the privacy of you not knowing that I sent Ed $10, right? There's solutions in place that they're putting out there to help with that. And those aren't specific to creating value within kind of blockchain. They would be valuable outside of blockchain. So when we look at healthcare privacy and really the importance of that, I think there are some carryover things that we're going to find that are really valuable, even if we're not using decentralized tech, just in those advances of different cryptography things that'll be transparent to the user, and it'll be kind of behind what's happening there, but really help with protecting the privacy there.
Yeah, thank you, Kyle. Curious, anyone, let's see, Bill also made a comment about a one-on-one course. Thank you, Bill. A question for everyone in the audience. Have you implemented a blockchain solution? And if so, would you mind sharing that with us? Don't be shy. Okay, Kyle, I want to give him a chance for that. This has been awesome. Hopefully we haven't been too hard on you. You're so knowledgeable and such an advocate for blockchain, and being involved in a successful project amongst some pretty large players is really impressive. So thank you so much. If everybody can practice or would like to go to your reactions and click on something that shows you how much you like Kyle, that'd be awesome. Well, I will do it.
Do appreciate it, and I do think there are a lot of opportunities to work together, and so finding ways in which we can work together, regardless of whether it's Synaptic or others. I think there's a lot of opportunity when we start looking at the need in healthcare to really drive some of that collaboration. And so, if I can ever be of service, definitely feel free to reach out. I'm happy to help and raise kind of awareness on this emerging space.
All right. Well, appreciate Kyle you helping us out here. You're awesome. Thank you all, and we'll see you next month, hopefully.
Thank you all.
Okay, bye.
Thank you.